it does seem to be that there was very little the government could do in terms of the actual problem, the supply side of the problem, and so alleviating how people may be able to afford energy was just about the only thing they could have done. How do you rate them out of 10?
Oh, very, very low indeed. I mean, just on your first point, clearly, if you want to help on the supply side, the one thing that you don't do is put a tax on things. So all that's happened there is it's become more expensive to drill oil and gas in the North Sea. And the result of that is that there will be less drilling of oil and gas in the North Sea, which medium to long term will mean that prices of those things, domestically at least, are higher, and we'll be importing more of those things in the longer term. So it's an utter disaster from the point of view of the one thing that is causing this crisis worldwide. Where I agree with you is you have to do something about the impact, particularly on the most vulnerable and those who are potentially at the borderline. Now, there the package has done two things. One, it's done targeted welfare, about £1,200 for those most in need. And the other part of the package is about £400 of everybody else, which hopefully does something about the cliff edge. Now, I appreciate that there have been some grumblings from various groups about whether or not those have been well targeted enough. Clearly, it's a disproportionate impact on different groups of people. The IFS today, for example, looked at that and said, okay, for some people, it's only a 5% benefit versus others about 17%. But that really isn't something the government can finely tune. This is an absolute increase in the cost of living because energy prices have gone up absolutely, and you're not going to be able to create a perfectly fair remedy for that for absolutely everybody. So that's the package as a whole. In respect to the inflation element to it, well, inflation is fundamentally a monetary phenomena. So the aggregate level of inflation across the economy is only going to go up if the volume of money goes up. What inflation does at a more nuanced level is increase the price of goods, and here increase the price of energy relative to everything else. So the things you want to spend your money on, like a nice TV or a holiday, or if you're at the bottom end of the income spectrum, just getting the food on the table, you've got less money to do that. So inflation should be understood in that way, not just about the ticket prices that you're paying.
And indeed, the unfunded element of this commitment, of course, £5 billion raised through that sort of slightly populist call for a windfall tax, although the Chancellor does try and explain or try and differentiate his version of a windfall tax from the Labour one by saying there are caveats if those companies do wish to invest. There's a sort of super deduction for those companies where they will be able to write off that extra tax. But I suppose looking at the other £10 billion, where on earth are they getting it from?
Well, that's a great question, but don't forget there are going to be windfall tax revenues across the economy, so we can't say precisely at this point whether or not the government is going to be getting it from existing sources of funding, simply because, say, VAT goes up, or they'll be doing it by printing money, that would be inflationary, or they'll be doing it by borrowing it from future generations, which again would be inflationary, at least in the short term. So I just want to pick you up, though, on that first bit, the $5 billion. That can't be true. If we look at the numbers, we know that this is a 10-month year, so the most that could come out of that tax increase is about $4 billion. And we also know that the government has said there's going to be no investment impact. Well, if there's no investment impact, then it's not going to be $4 billion. That's going to be offset by about 91% they claimed, although that's not really the full picture with that particular part of the tax. And so it's either going to be the case they're going to get some money from the oil and gas companies and a lot of investment, or they're going to get a lot of money from the oil and gas companies now, no investment, and then a lot less money in future. So the whole thing is a bit of a shambles and a real headline-chasing policy that they should never have considered.
Is this potentially just some pretty nifty spin from the Chancellor in that case? If all of these companies do a superb amount of investment in the North Sea, if all these companies do a superb amount of investment into our economy and in our transition to net zero, then not that much cash will be raised at all by this measure, but we still get the headlines of a windfall tax. The government wins because a windfall tax is popular right now, despite what the impacts of a windfall tax might be in the medium to long term. And indeed, the United Kingdom may win as well with that extra investment. And the government, I suppose, will scrape up the cash from those extra VAT receipts from the inflation that we're seeing around the rest of the economy.
So prior to the imposition of the windfall tax, BP and Shell said they were investing about £43 billion between them, both in the North Sea, but principally in net zero projects. BP has already said we're going to be reviewing that portfolio, which is wise, they have to. Shell have said, well, hang on, we're not getting any benefit at all for our net zero projects from this tax investment allowance. So all that happens is it's It's an incentive to invest more in the North Sea, or rather to be taxed a little bit less on the new investments you'd already had planned. So we should expect investment to go down, and particularly with the smaller companies that don't often get the headlines, where their projects are much more marginal. They won't necessarily be able to afford a project that has a 65% tax rate on it.
I suppose finally in this conversation, Andy Meyer, we're seeing some concerning headlines around energy security in this country. Now, this isn't something that any sort of subsidy can fix, but potentially we're looking at blackouts this year.
Well, this was the headline from the Bay's scenario planning just over the weekend, and it is extraordinary. These things would have been going on while the Cabinet was considering whether or not to impose the windfall tax. So one part of government is saying, if we don't have enough gas, we're going to have blackouts. And the other part of government is saying, we're going to tax gas domestically, which is a surefire way to ensure that we won't have enough gas in future. So it's totally extraordinary. Now, the good news from that, though, is that it's highly unlikely that we will experience blackouts in the near term. What tends to happen is there is a cascade of different things that the national grid can do in order, for example, to shut down heavy industry. Not a good thing, but something that means that you can prioritise hospitals and homes in terms of heating and lighting. So there isn't yet a fundamental and substantial risk of this happening, but there could be if the government keeps going down this path of trying to make oil and gas as expensive as possible and discouraging domestic investment.